My son-in-law kept looking at the bookshelf. Not the books. The shelf itself, the lower left corner where the wood was slightly warped, where I'd tucked a manila envelope behind a copy of The Hockey Sweater that had been sitting there since my wife passed. He'd been in my house for 20 minutes. He'd already looked at that corner 3 times. My daughter Claire was in the kitchen making tea. She'd asked where I kept the chamomile, even though she'd known where I kept the chamomile since she was 9 years old. I wondered, briefly, if she'd asked on purpose. "Nice place," my son-in-law said. His name was Derek. He said it the same way a contractor says it when he's already calculating what the demo will cost. 41 years, I said. He nodded like that was quaint. I'm 63. I spent 31 of those years as a licensed land surveyor working contracts across northern Ontario, Sudbury, Timmins, up past Kapuskasing in winters that would turn your fingers white in 20 minutes. I'm not a wealthy man by Bay Street standards, but I own my house outright. I have a decent RRSP, and I have a lake property near Parry Sound that my father built with his own hands in 1974. It's worth considerably more now than it was then. Derek knew this. He'd asked about it the first time Claire brought him home, 14 months ago. I remember thinking it was an odd third question to ask a man you just met. Claire came back with the tea. She set mine in front of me without making eye contact. That was the second thing I noticed. My daughter is 34. She's a nurse at Sunnybrook. She's one of the most composed people I've ever known. The kind of person who stays calm when everything around her is falling apart. Which is probably why she chose the profession she did. She gets that from her mother, so when she sat down and folded her hands in her lap like she was waiting for something to happen, I paid attention. "We wanted to talk to you about the cottage," Derek said. There it was. He had a whole presentation prepared. That's not a figure of speech. He'd actually brought a folder. He laid it on my coffee table and opened it like he was presenting to a board. He talked about optimizing underutilized assets. He talked about a rental management company he knew, someone who could list the property on short-term rental platforms and generate income while I still technically retained ownership. He talked about the tax advantages of transferring partial interest to a family trust. He used the phrase estate planning 4 times in 8 minutes. Claire looked out the window the entire time. I'm a surveyor. I spent 3 decades reading land. I know how to look at a piece of ground and understand what's underneath it, what it can hold, what it can't. Sitting across from Derek, I had the same feeling I get when the soil doesn't match the map. The sense that what you're being shown and what's actually there are 2 entirely different things. I told him I'd think about it. He smiled the way people smile when they think they've already won. Claire was quiet the whole drive home. That was in March. By June, he was calling me directly. The call started as check-ins. How are you feeling? Getting out enough? Had I thought any more about what we'd discussed? He mentioned twice that managing a property at my age could become burdensome. He said the word burdensome gently, the way you'd lower something fragile onto a hard surface. I wrote it down after the second call. Not because I was keeping a record. I just wanted to see it in my own handwriting, to make sure I wasn't imagining the shape of what he was doing. In July, Claire came alone. That was unusual. She and Derek were attached at the hip, had been since the beginning. She showed up on a Wednesday afternoon, which was also unusual because she works Wednesdays. She said she'd traded a shift. We sat on the back deck. She'd brought butter tarts from a bakery in the annex that I like. She set the box on the table between us, and then didn't open it. "How are things?" I asked. "Fine," she said. She stared at the tree line for a long moment. I waited. I've learned, over the years, that silence is a better tool than questions. People will fill silence if you let them. Claire had learned the same thing from somewhere, possibly from me. So we sat together for almost 5 full minutes without speaking, both of us waiting the other out. Eventually she said, "He means well." I said, "I know." She looked at me then, and something moved across her face that I couldn't quite name. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was the look of someone who is choosing, very carefully, what to say and what to leave out. "Just don't rush anything," she said. "Okay? Whatever you decide about the cottage, don't let anyone rush you. I told her I wouldn't. She opened the butter tarts then, and we ate them and talked about nothing in particular. When she left, she hugged me for a few seconds longer than usual. I stood in the driveway and watched her car until it turned off my street, and then I went inside and called my accountant. His name is Frank. We've known each other since our kids were in elementary school together. He's the kind of man who answers the phone on the second ring and gets to the point without wasting your time. I told him what Derek had presented in March. I read him the notes I'd taken from the July phone calls. Frank was quiet in the way that means he's thinking, not the way that means he's uncomfortable. He's not entirely wrong about the tax angle, Frank said, but the way he's framing it, partial interest transfer to a family trust before any formal estate plan is in place, that protects him, not you. Once you transfer any interest, your ability to sell or develop independently gets complicated. Depending on how the trust is structured, you could end up needing his signature to do anything with your own property. I asked him how long something like that would take to unravel if I'd already signed. Frank said, that depends on how good his lawyer is. I thanked him and hung up. Then I sat in my kitchen for a while. The house was quiet. It's always quiet now. Has been for 7 years, since my wife Margaret passed. I used to mind it more than I do now. That night I minded it again, but for different reasons. Quietness gives you space to think. I had a lot to think about. I didn't tell Claire what Frank had said. I didn't call Derek back when he left a voicemail in August about a follow-up meeting. I did, however, quietly call a real estate lawyer named Susan Park, who a colleague had recommended, and I had a long conversation with her about my options, and about what documentation I should make sure existed and where it should be kept. I updated my will. I created a power of attorney that named my brother Ted rather than Claire, not because I didn't trust my daughter, but because I was no longer sure what pressures were being applied to her, or from which direction. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters. I never believed Claire was my enemy. I believed she was caught. There's a particular kind of paralysis that settles over people who love someone they've begun to suspect. You keep hoping you're wrong. You keep finding small reasons to believe the picture is different from what it looks like. You stay, and you wait, and you tell yourself that if things get bad enough, you'll say something. You just haven't decided yet what bad enough looks like. I knew this because I'd watched it happen to Margaret's sister 30 years ago. Different situation, same architecture. In September, Derek called again. This time he mentioned, very casually, that he and Claire had spoken to a financial advisor about the long-term picture, and that they were concerned about my ability to manage the Perry Sound property alone as I got older. He used the phrase, quality of life. He mentioned a seniors community in Barrie that had incredible amenities and was more affordable than people expect. He said a few of his colleagues had placed parents there and the feedback had been very positive. I was 63 years old. I'd canoed the French River the previous summer. I'd reshingled my own roof in May. I wrote down the name of the seniors community. Then I called Ted. Ted is my younger brother by 4 years. He's a retired OPP officer. He lives in Kenora now, but he still knows people, and more importantly, he still thinks like a cop, which means he knows how to find information without anyone knowing he's looking for it. I told him what I knew. I told him what I suspected. I asked him to find out what he could about Derek without tipping anyone off. Ted called me back 10 days later. Derek had 2 previous common law partnerships, both ending within 3 years. The first woman he'd been with had transferred her car and a small savings account to a numbered company Derek had incorporated during their relationship. She got neither back. The second had co-signed on a line of credit. The balance, when they separated, had been drawn down to the limit. Neither woman had gone to the police. One had consulted a lawyer and then, apparently, decided against pursuing it. Ted couldn't find out why. There was no criminal record. There was no fraud conviction. There was only a pattern, like a water line on a basement wall. The kind of thing that tells you water has been there before, will probably be there again, and that whoever built this house knew it and didn't say anything. I sat with that information for 2 weeks. I didn't want to blow up my daughter's life. I need you to understand that. Claire was 34. She had a career she'd worked hard for, an apartment they shared downtown, friends, a life. Derek was not some obvious monster. He was charming and well presented, and he asked thoughtful questions and remembered details from previous conversations. He had the particular gift of making people feel seen. I understand how someone falls for that. I understand it completely. But I also knew that I couldn't unknow what I knew, and I knew that whatever I decided to do, I needed to be ready to do it when the moment came, not when I'd finished deliberating about it. My daughter's birthday is October 12th. She turned 35 this year, and she'd wanted a dinner. Nothing elaborate, just the three of us at a restaurant she liked in the distillery district. I agreed. Derek made the reservation. I drove downtown, parked on Mill Street, and walked over in the early evening when the light was going golden over the brick. They were already there when I arrived. Derek was talking, Claire was listening. Neither of them saw me come in. I stood near the host stand for about 10 seconds watching them, not long enough to be strange, just long enough to see the thing I'd been quietly looking for. It was the way she was sitting, slightly turned away, both hands wrapped around her water glass. A very small, very controlled stillness that I recognized because I'd seen it in my kitchen back in July. The look of someone deciding, very carefully, what to say and what to leave out. I sat down. Derek shook my hand. Claire smiled and said she was glad I was there. We ordered. The food was good. Derek talked about a project at work and about a hockey pool he was in at his office. He asked me about the cottage, how the fall had treated it, whether I'd started thinking about winterizing. I said the caretaker had taken care of it. He nodded like that was fine, but his eyes moved the way they always moved, a small recalibration, like a compass needle adjusting. Halfway through the main course, Claire excused herself to use the restroom. Derek watched her go, then glanced at his phone. I reached for my water glass. When I set it back down, I noticed that Claire had left her phone face down on the table in a slightly unusual position, turned just far enough that Derek couldn't see the screen from his angle, but I could from mine. She left a note open in her notes app, 5 words. Dad, be careful, please. Tonight, I looked up. Derek was reading something on his own phone. I looked back at the table. I made sure my face didn't change. When Claire came back, she picked up her phone and tucked it in her purse without looking at me. But she touched my hand briefly as she sat down, just her fingers on my wrist for a moment, the way you'd reassure someone before something difficult. That was when I understood that she hadn't been paralyzed at all. She'd been waiting to. She just hadn't known what I knew, or how much, or whether I'd be ready. And now she did. Derek ordered dessert for the table without asking us. He did it smoothly, the way he did most things, not rudely, just with the natural authority of someone who decided some time ago that the decisions were his to make. While the server was still writing it down, he pulled out a thin folder and set it on the table. I hope this is okay, he said, looking at me. I just thought, since we're all together, I had Susan put together a summary of the family trust structure we discussed. Nothing to sign tonight, just to look at. Susan, not Susan Park, my lawyer. A different Susan, his. He opened the folder. There was a document inside. Clean, professional, 3 pages. At the bottom of the first page was a signature line with my name already printed beneath it. Claire was very still. I looked at the document for a moment. Then I closed the folder and slid it back across the table. Derek, I said, I know about the line of credit. The table went quiet. In the restaurant around us, things continued. Cutlery, conversation, a server laughing at something across the room. At our table, there was a stillness so complete it had texture. His face went through several things in rapid succession. Surprise first. Then a very fast recalibration. Then something that tried to be confusion. I'm sorry? I know about the women before Claire, I said. Both of them. I know about the numbered company. I know about the line of credit. I know what the pattern looks like. I kept my voice level. A restaurant is a good place for this kind of conversation because it requires everyone to stay quiet. I also want you to know that I've already spoken to a lawyer. My will is current. My power of attorney is in place. And there's nothing you can do with that document or anything like it. Not now, and not after tonight. Derek looked at Claire. It was a particular kind of look, the look of someone checking whether their ally is still in position. Claire was looking at me, and there were tears in her face, though she wasn't crying the way people cry when they're upset. She was crying the way people cry when something they've been holding for a very long time finally gets to be set down. "I've been trying to figure out how to tell you," she said. Her voice was steady. "I found something on his laptop in August. Account statements. I didn't understand all of it, but I knew it wasn't right. And I didn't know if you'd believe me or if he'd." She stopped. Took a breath. I didn't know how to say it. Derek pushed his chair back from the table. He started to say something about misunderstandings, about context, about things being taken out of proportion. He said it with such fluency that I understood this was not the first time he'd had this speech ready. He was good at it. If I hadn't already known what I knew, it might have worked. "You should go," I told him. He looked around the restaurant. People at nearby tables had stopped pretending not to listen. He picked up the folder. He left. Claire and I sat at that table for another hour. The server brought the dessert Derek had ordered, a chocolate torte, and we ate it and we talked. She told me about August, about what she'd found, about the weeks of trying to decide what to do with it. She told me she'd started keeping her own notes, her own records, the same way I had independently, without either of us knowing the other was doing it. "I left that note open on purpose," she said. "I didn't know another way to tell you that I was ready." I told her about Frank, about Susan Park, about Ted and what he'd found. Her face changed as I talked, not shocked exactly, but settling the way ground settles after a freeze, becoming firmer. We split the bill. Claire had parked closer, so she walked me to my car on Mill Street. It was full dark by then, October, cold coming off the lake. The kind of air that makes you feel your own aliveness clearly. She hugged me at the driver's side door. "I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner," she said into my shoulder. I told her what I should have told her 7 months ago, what I'd been slow to understand myself, that she'd said it exactly when she needed to, and so had I, and that was what mattered. I drove home along the 401, then north on the 400, windows down a little, even in the cold. The house was quiet when I got in, the way it always is. I made tea. I stood at the kitchen window for a while looking at the backyard, at the maple Margaret planted the year we moved in, at the way the branches moved against the dark sky. Some things you protect because they're valuable. Some things you protect because they're yours. The best ones, the lake in the fall, the maple in the backyard, a daughter who leaves you a note instead of saying nothing. Those aren't really either. They're just the parts of your life that turned out to be irreplaceable, and you don't always know which ones those are until something moves toward them. I knew now. That was enough. There's a maple in my backyard that Margaret planted the year we moved in. It's close to 40 years old now. The trunk is thick enough that I can't wrap both hands around it. I used to walk past it without really seeing it, the way you stop seeing things that have always been there. That night, standing at the kitchen window after driving home from the distillery district, I saw it again. Really saw it. And I thought about roots. What Derek never understood, what people like him are constitutionally unable to understand, is that the things worth taking are never actually takeable. You can transfer a title. You can drain an account. You can move an old man into a facility and bury and call it care. But you cannot take what a person has built inside themselves over 63 years of showing up honestly to their own life. That's not stored anywhere he could have found it, even if he'd looked in every corner of every room. I've been thinking about what made the difference. Not luck. I want to be clear about that, because I think luck is the story we tell when we don't want to examine the actual mechanics of how things go wrong or right. What made the difference was 3 things, and I didn't fully see them as separate things until I was standing at that window. The first was integrity, not the word you put in a LinkedIn profile, but the actual practice of living in a way where your private actions and your public ones match. Frank knew to take my call seriously because we'd been straight with each other for 20 years. Susan Park took my case because I came to her with clean hands. Ted helped me because he knew, without me having to say it, that I wasn't asking him to do anything I'd be ashamed of later. Integrity is slow to build and fast to spend. And the reason Derek's plan had no foundation is that he'd spent his long before he walked into my house. The second was clear thinking under pressure. Not cleverness. I'm not a clever man. But I've spent 30 years reading land, which means I've spent 30 years learning not to trust my first impression of a surface and not to panic when the map doesn't match the ground. I wrote things down. I called people who knew more than I did. I waited until I understood the shape of what I was dealing with before I moved. That's not instinct. That's a discipline you build slowly, through practice, and it holds when you need it to. The third was Claire. Or rather, it was the years I'd spent making sure that when Claire needed to reach me, she believed she could. That note on her phone wasn't an accident. It was the result of 34 years of a daughter knowing her father was the kind of man who would see it, understand it, and not fall apart. She was ready because I was ready. We held each other up without either of us knowing that's what we were doing. Derek walked out of that restaurant with a folder and nothing else. I drove home with everything that had always mattered. The maple is still there. It'll be there long after I'm gone. Some things you protect, not because they're valuable, but because they're the truest version of what you decided to be. That's enough.